آله وصحبه أجمعين. And I was unable to bring you to order. With my students, I tend to start abusing. I pick out one or two of them and start making fun of them, but I didn't want to do that with you in a foreign country. So we will continue the study of Orientalism. Now, I told Mizan this. I said, I think I'm not giving you your whatever equivalent, metaphorical equivalent of money's worth, because this is all in my book. So I feel really bad. You can read this in the book, but I hope it benefits you, which is good. So this study of the Hadith tradition by scholars like Goldzeher, Muir, Schacht, does not go uncontested. It doesn't go uncontested in the Western Academy. It doesn't go uncontested by Muslim scholars writing in English or writing against some of these critics. And what you see is that there's, in the second half of the 20th century, you find a number of scholars, some of them of Middle Eastern origin, some of them Muslim, some of them Christians. People like Nabia Abbott. I've been told her original name was Nabiha Aboud. I don't know if this is accurate. The person who told me this is generally reliable, but sometimes is not. Like all of us, like myself included. So Nabia Abbott was originally, she's an Iraqi Christian, and she moved to the United States, and she eventually became a professor at the University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago Oriental Institute has a collection of early Arabic papyri, and also not just papyri, but paper copies of segments of the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal from the 800s of the Common Era. This is very important, by the way, and I'm going to be jumping ahead of myself. It's the second item here. I will shut up and follow my own instruction. Abbott, and I think I don't want to sort of assign intentions to her that she might not have had, but I get the sense from her work that she was standing up for a tradition that she felt was not being given its due credit. It was not being taken seriously enough. She wasn't Muslim. I don't think that she was defending Islam as a religion, but she was defending what she felt was a tradition that had not been studied with a seriousness that it deserved, with the seriousness it deserved. Very important, so looking at these papyrus fragments, which came from the late 700s of the Common Era, mid to late 700s. So we're talking around the time of Malik and his students. She came to a few conclusions. And I'll just give you some of the explanation she offers for what Goldzeher and Schacht and Yoingbo had found. Okay. So no one is disputing that a hadith in the of al-Shafi'i is, the hadith in Muwatta of Malik is something a successor said. And then in the of al-Shafi'i it's something the companion says. And then in Sahih Bukhari it's something the Prophet said. No one is disputing that fact. I'm not trying to say that's the only evidence out there. But how do we explain this? One of the things that Yoingbo talks about is that, you look in Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, or you look at, the number of hadiths attributed to the companion Ibn Abbas, 1,600 hadiths maybe, 1,600 hadiths. And yet you find reports that Ibn Abbas only transmitted 9 hadiths, sometimes. Ibn Abbas was either 9 or 14 years old when the Prophet died. How could he hear all these hadiths? You hear this often with Abu Hurairah. This is, by the way, the worst argument I've ever heard in my life. Anytime everyone gives you this argument, I don't care what you think about hadith, if you believe them or not, but this argument is idiotic. The argument that Abu Hurairah only knew the Prophet for 3 years, so how did he hear, these over 5,000 hadiths? Because he didn't hear them all from the Prophet, obviously, duh. He doesn't say, I heard the Prophet say. It's very rarely do you see Abu Hurairah quoting the Prophet directly. He's hearing it from other companions. And he doesn't quote them because, like normal human beings, we don't go around quoting, for example, I don't go around telling you who told me, who they heard from, who heard from Martin Luther King. I just quote Martin Luther King because that's what normal people do. They don't give their chains of transmission for stuff that's just in their daily life. It's only later on when Muslims become obsessed with isnads and trains of transmission that they start doing that. This is completely normal. So this is I kind of got off topic, but this is important. When you see these, how do you explain the fact that someone says Ibn Abbas only transmits, a small number of hadiths, but then there's thousands of narrations of this hadith that are attributed to him? One of the things that Abbott says is that this is a very important point. Early scholars, and actually Muslim scholars till this day, use the word hadith to indicate two different things. And this is an example. People love to say how Arabic is this perfect language that can communicate. Actually, sometimes Arabic is not the best language, or at least the way it's used is not the best way. And sometimes English can be more useful, because there's a difference between traditions and what I say called traditions and narrations, between hadith and riwayah. Hadith and riwayah. A hadith, or tradition, we can think about being a general idea of something the Prophet said. To give this earlier example, whoever lies about me intentionally, let him prepare for himself a seat in hell. This is something the Prophet said. Now, there's lots of different versions of this. There's some versions that lack certain words, that add certain words. Because there's all these narrations of this one tradition. From 60 companions, 70 companions, 80 companions. Other hadiths maybe from 2 companions, 4 companions. You have lots of different narrations of one tradition. Sometimes the Prophet might have said it more than once, and different companions heard him on different occasions. Muslim scholars, when they speak of hadiths, will generally associate them with a companion. A hadith is something that a specific companion heard the Prophet say. So you'll have instances in which they're talking about the hadith of Ibn Umar, the hadith of Ibn Abbas, and you're saying to yourself, wait a second, this is the same hadith. I mean, it's the same general thing the Prophet said. Why are there different hadiths here? Because hadith is being used to indicate the transmissions of these different companions of one tradition. When someone says that Ahmed ibn Hanbal selected the Musnad from 750,000 hadiths, that doesn't mean that there's 750,000 different things the Prophet said. These are 750,000 different narrations. And if you imagine how these narrations ramify as people sit and study and transmit and spread knowledge, this is not difficult to believe. When they say, how could the very fact that all these things spread in this number means that so much is being made up, obviously. If companions are transmitting 5,000 hadiths at the most, how can you have 750,000 hadiths later on? Some obviously are made up, and Muslim scholars, by the way, had no problem admitting that. That's why they started the science of hadith criticism. They didn't start it because they had free time and didn't have anything to do. They had a problem, which is people were making up hadiths. Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, who died in 160, the famous Basran hadith critic, he said 3/4 of the hadiths I find are made up. The ones that I come across, 3/4 of them are made up. But this multiplication is because you have to remember that they might be talking about narrations of hadiths, not just the actual tradition that the Prophet said. So this is an important distinction that Abbott highlights. Second, technology. You all have paper. You're writing on paper. Isn't that wonderful? Well, some of you are writing on electronic devices, which is even more wonderful. Unless there's an electromagnetic pulse weapon that goes off, in which case you're all toast. Technology is important. Before this wonderful product of wood pulp that's mashed and pressed, and then you get this great thing called paper. Before Muslims had that in the late 700s, around 790, 780, it starts coming in from Central Asia to places like Baghdad. What are they writing on? Papyrus. Papyrus is very expensive. You take this reed from the Nile River and a few other places, and you cut it into little sheets, and you paste them together. It's kind of sticky, and you put some solution on it to stick it together. You get a sheet that's yay wide maybe, and as long as the reed is, and you paste these together, and you get a long scroll, and that's how basically that's how you write books until around 200, 300 of the Common Era. Book is actually a scroll. The idea of a book that opens like this, a codex, this really starts appearing in around 200 to 300 of the Common Era. But still papyrus, or vellum, what's called parchment, treated animal skin. Also, papyrus is expensive, vellum is expensive, parchment is expensive. How many rabbits can I kill? How many goats can I kill? And sheep can I kill? And segments of sheepskin can I get to write a book? This is expensive stuff, people. You can't write a lot. That's why, the Zuhri, Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, who died 124, 742 of the Common Era, very important transmitter from Medina and Syria. His whole library could fit into one saddlebag. He'd carry it in his, this is the reports. Hassan al-Basri, famous Basran scholar, died in 110, 728 of the Common Era. His ilm, his knowledge was on this scroll, papyrus scroll about 6 inches in diameter. Ahmed ibn Hanbal's library was 12 and a half camel loads of books. Scholars like At-Tabari, many, many dozens of camel loads of books. Huge amounts of material. How do we explain this? Ahmed ibn Hanbal, 12 and a half camel loads of books. Zuhri, 1 saddlebag. How do we explain this difference? Ahmed ibn Hanbal had paper, people. He had paper. It's cheap, you can write. And it's also not that thick. If you see, parchment is, even if you thin it out, it's still pretty thick. If you see these, like the Mus'haf Uthmani in Istanbul or in Tashkent, I mean, these things are like, they're like this big, and they're huge. It's not something you can carry with you. Paper allows you to write stuff down. When someone like a Zuhri or these early scholars in the mid-700s are writing, they're not writing all the versions of a hadith down that they find. They don't have the space. What they're writing is basically notes to jog their memory. That's why they were so careful about making sure that they read their hadiths to people, that people didn't just look at their notes, that some of them buried their material after they died or burned it. Because it's like reading my lecture notes, not these ones. If you read my lecture notes, you will think I'm an utter lunatic. And you will not get the correct idea about what I'm trying to say, because you'll see bizarre language, misspelling, weird scribbles, coffee stains, things like that. Not accurate. When you get paper, you can just start writing down all the hadiths you hear, all the narrations of hadiths you hear. Ahmed ibn Hanbal's Musnad, which he selected from his corpus of hadith that he collected, is huge. About 40,000, it depends. Around, I think the best count is about 27,000 narrations, anywhere between a third and a fourth of which are repetitions. You can actually start writing down, I mean, when people say musnads of scholars, the musnad of someone like Qutayb bin Sa'id, the musnad of Baqi ibn Mukhlad, this is literally their hadith collection, what they collect over their lifetime of collection. And then they might select from this material to put into different books that they would use for different purposes. But you can have people who are actually collecting. I mean, some books, the Mu'jam of a scholar named al-Masarjisi, who died in 360, about 970 of the Common Era. I think I calculated this. it's in my book on Bukhari and Muslim. I think if it were published, it doesn't exist because only a madman would copy something so big, or someone with a lot of free time. It doesn't exist, it didn't survive. But it would be something like 200 volumes, I think I calculated. It would be 200 volumes in a library today if it were published. Huge collections. Yes?
Isn't it possible also we have to remember the context of the society we're living in? Remember, this is a society early on in Islam where it was very much oral tradition. And therefore, we need books to remember or to refer to. And scholars at that time often memorized things with tremendous amount of memory. Like, for example, Imam Shafi, I've heard, could almost memorize a book with one reading. And when they therefore gave that knowledge on with the Ijaza system to some of their students, it's perfectly conceivable.
I mean, people did, it's important to remember that knowledge is primarily oral. Right? These books exist to jog your memory. The Quran in a mushaf is not the Quran, it's just there to jog your memory, basically. But it's also important to remember that once someone like a Zuhri, yes, their knowledge primarily oral. They had written, Zuhri was a big advocate of writing knowledge down because writing is important. You know, we can talk about how they had great memories, and scholars, Muslim scholars to this day have amazing memories. I will be the first person to throw myself at their feet and wish that I could have memories like that. But they also understood that memory fails you. Memory fails you, and you need to have written copies. Bukhari says this in one of his books, I think, praying behind reading behind the Imam in prayer. He favors written, if someone has written material, he favors this over someone who doesn't have written material. So you can check that. It's very important. So Ahmed ibn Hanbal, you can't memorize the Musnad. I would be surprised if someone memorized the Musnad word for word. This would surprise me. You can't do that, you have to write it down. And if you do it, you certainly are not going to be able to be reliable. Because how could someone possibly know you're being accurate?
Maybe for later. I think we're
Okay.
my last question.
So another important distinction, point made by Abbott, is that this is something that I've ended up studying a lot. Muslim scholars treated different subjects of hadith differently. They were, and they say this very clearly, you have this attributed to Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi, his teacher, to other figures from his generation, from the late 700s to the early 800s. If a hadith comes to me dealing with halal and haram, dealing with ahkam, dealing with fara'id, inheritance, dealing with salah, prayer, we are strict about the isnads. If someone brings me a hadith about the virtues of actions, this and such an action will get you such and such a reward in paradise. About adab, manners. About preaching, things that will make people, soften their hearts. Then we're not strict about the isnad. They said this very explicitly. That example I gave earlier about a hadith that says, be good to your mother. Why are you going to sit and spend your time criticizing this to see if the Prophet really said this? Because you know you have to be good to your mother already. If you find a hadith that says you have to divide up your inheritance in this specific way, you better treat that critically because this is going to affect people's lives. It's going to affect the law. So we need to be sensitive to what the subject is that they're looking at. You can't, let's say, look at how a Muslim scholar is dealing with Ahmed ibn Hanbal has a kitab al-Zuhd, book of asceticism. This book is so much material in it. It's very odd. Stuff about Moses and Jesus and all sorts of sources. It's like Ahmed ibn Hanbal. He must really have been he really didn't understand how to be critical. Because it is not a serious issue for him. This is not an issue that needs to be treated with the rigor of law, hadiths about law. And much of these, especially if it's not coming from the Prophet, ﷺ, if it's coming from earlier prophets like Moses and Jesus, if it's coming from companions, they just didn't spend that much time criticizing it. Because it wasn't, it's there to benefit you. They didn't think that it was going to alter core areas of the religion. Other scholars. Andrew mentioned Professor al-Azami. You know, I'm going to reveal my biases. Actually, I would say I'm going to reveal maybe the latent racism that is part of life in the West, and the way that people think about Muslim scholars. When his book on Shaykh, his criticism of Shaykh, I saw this book and I did not read it. I didn't read it because I thought there's going to be some Muslim scholar who's saying stupid stuff that isn't going to convince anybody, and it's just going to be a pietistic attempt to rebut a Western scholar, and it's not going to convince anybody. I'm not going to waste my time. So when I was writing my book on Hadith, I said, you know, I actually have to look at the book. I have to be thorough. I have to say something about it. Yeah, maybe a few lines I'll put in. Reading this book, this is an excellent book. These are really good arguments. And I ended up including, you know, I think maybe a whole page, which is a book, a relatively small book, it's a lot. It was an excellent book. I was extremely impressed. And I immediately took this lesson into consideration and, you know, rebuked myself for my prejudices and for my assumptions. So it's important that we, maybe it isn't important, but I will confess my initial approach and I will confess my error. And if Professor al-Azami ever sees this lecture, he can take this as my praise for his book. He makes a number of important corrections to Shaykh's work. One of them is, and this is an excellent point, he doesn't say it in as many words, but it's certainly in the book, which is this hadith tradition is vast. The hadith tradition is vast. Just the 6 books, you're talking about this much book. You add Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, you're talking this much book. You add a few other books, you're talking about the whole wall lined with books. You add just the printed hadith books of the Sunni tradition, this whole wall easily. Then the whole other wall, then the whole other wall, then the whole room fills up. This is a massive amount of material. All these judgments, all these criticisms, are by definition based on a small sampling of that material. So whatever we say about this material, however we look at it, I could come into the room and I could say, I'm going to assume that these things attributed to the Prophet are authentic until proven otherwise. That's one approach. I could come in and say, this is all made up. Maybe there's some accurate stuff in there, but the assumption is this is all made up. Or I could say, I honestly have no idea. I could say, I just have no position. The position of the Orientalist tradition really had been, with Shaykh and Oneworld, had been, this is all made up. But based on what? Based on a small amount of information that had been studied, a tiny, tiny fragment. Is that really an accurate way to judge? I mean, this is a very good question. Is that really an accurate way to judge things? You might look at a few traditions and decide that they're made up. But what if they're the exception, not the rule? As I said before, you know, the Prophet existed. We know that. And assuming that he was like other prophets, you know, that he said things, and that people cared about what he said, it's not inconceivable that somebody wrote this down or transmitted it. It's not inconceivable that he said something over the 23 years of his life. So, and it's also, if people really cared about his words and deeds, it's not inconceivable that there was quite a bit of material that was recorded from him, transmitted from him. And why should we doubt that there's several books full of material that the Prophet said somewhere? I mean, why should we doubt that? not everything that's attributed to him should simply be dismissed as automatically made up. Because something out there, he said something out there. The question is, how do I identify it? When Goldziher and Shaykh looked at the material they examined, especially with Goldziher, you'll find that he'll give you an example. Let's say Ghiyath bin Ibrahim. Ghiyath bin Ibrahim he gives us an example of someone who forged a hadith for political reasons. He was in the court of the Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasid Caliph liked pigeons or doves, and so he made up a hadith that says there's no gambling or racing animals except something that has a hoof or a wing. I'm just summarizing the hadith. He adds a winged thing in there. So now I'm allowing you to race and raise and gamble pigeons. Now, this material, this hadith, Goldziher says someone made up this hadith to curry favor with the court. But this hadith doesn't exist anywhere. No, this hadith isn't in like Bukhari. This story only exists in Muslim books on hadith criticism, where they're giving you an example of somebody who's forging a hadith for political reasons. So, I mean, it's like taking, that's like I have a book of instances in which I've caught students cheating. How do you identify a student cheating? Here's an example. And then someone comes and finds this book and says, look at how much the students were cheating. See this? This is not a good argument, because I'm listing this as an exception. And oftentimes you'll see this, that the material that is being used to criticize the hadith tradition is stuff that Muslim scholars themselves have put forward as being made up. This hadith about Muawiyah being under the throne of God, no one thinks this is authentic hadith that I know of. I mean, this is included in books, but it's either just not described, which is, I think, a fault on the part of Muslim scholars, and it's a fault that numerous Muslim scholars like al-Dhahabi and Ibn Hajar mentioned centuries ago. They said you can't just list something and not say it's forged, because if you list something and you're quiet, the assumption is that you think it's accurate. But a lot of these hadith, Muslim scholars themselves acknowledge were made up. Just because it's in a book doesn't mean they think it's accurate. It's not in Sahih al-Bukhari. It's not in Sahih Muslim. Another important point that al-Azami makes is that Shaykh had relied on a very small number of books. The of a Shafi'i, the 6 books. These are not in any way exhaustive, or even, they don't exhaust even a portion of the material, of the hadith material that existed at the times of their authors, or the material that exists today that's published from that period, or the material that exists today as in manuscript form. So if you're going to make arguments about from silence, e silentio, you're going to say that this hadith doesn't exist before Shafi'i, with Shafi'i is attributed to the Prophet, therefore Shafi'i, someone made it up in this time period. You better go and search everything. At least everything that's published. At the time of Shaykh, much material was not published. A lot of books like the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq San'ani was not published. It's difficult to look at. Another important point he makes is that there's all sorts of reasons why someone might not transmit or have access to a hadith. The regional issue we discussed earlier. Different companions went to different cities. Ibn Mas'ud went to Kufa. Amr ibn al-As went to Egypt. Ibn Abbas stayed in Mecca. Other scholars went to Medina. Other people went to Yemen. Yes?
Is it true that Shaykh also used, the sampling he used was incorrect, in that he used books of fiqh and polemical works of one madhab against another, as opposed to books of hadith?
Well, it depends, because the contains polemical works. I mean, the contains books like Ikhtilaf, Malik, and things like that. There's some of Shafi's works with debates with people are included in this book. Does that answer your question?
But I think one of the points Al-Azami made is rather than use books of hadith to examine hadith, he used works of fiqh.
Well, for him, the distinction is immaterial, because if you're making a legal argument, that's even more reason why you should be bringing all the hadiths to bear that you could. So if you don't, in this case, then the hadith doesn't exist. Now, later on, if you're talking about, a Hanbali scholar writing a book in the year 1300 or 1600, and he writes a book of fiqh and doesn't have hadith in it, that's because he doesn't want to bother you with that. He's giving you the rules of the Hanbali madhab. If I went and looked at this book and said, look at this, it doesn't have hadith in it. Muslims don't care about hadith. Hadiths are all made up after the year 1600 when this book was written. That would be a very bad argument. So it's possible that in the early period, and this is one of the arguments that al-Azami makes, which is that sometimes people get in debates and they don't feel the need to give all the evidence they have. This is, again, a common sense instance. We may be having a debate and I give you one hadith as my evidence and I don't give you 5 others. And what he brings up an excellent quote of a Shafi'i from Shafi'i's Risala, where Shafi'i says, in this book I'm going to give you, I write down material that I have memorized right now. Some of my books I don't have now. I know I have this hadith in another book with a full isnad, but I only have memorized this broken isnad version, which I'm writing down for you. So this is, sometimes they're away from their books, or they lost a book. So there's all sorts of instances in which someone is not going to be including the best possible evidence or exhaust all the evidence at their disposal. Now, yes?
Just very quickly on the exception versus the rule. When you mentioned that Shu'bah said that 3/4 of the hadith that I come across are forged or not true, how does that reconcile with what Mr. al-Azami was saying about it being the exception rather than the rule?
I'm not trying to say that forgery was the exception.
Yeah.
Remember, when you're talking about forgery, this is a society-wide issue. So the stuff that's forged completely doesn't even make it into, let's say, the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. To be in the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, you have to have an isnad. That was the first step in criticizing material. Imagine someone like Shu'bah sitting in Basra, and someone comes up to him and says, I heard the Prophet said that, the best women are women from Basra. Shu'bah says, who told you this? It's like, the Prophet said it, I heard. Okay, it's a waste of my time. Leave me alone. It's utter nonsense. You don't even know where this material comes from. That doesn't even get into the discussion. That's the stuff he's talking about. 3/4 of the material. Now he's collected, let's say, a book of hadiths with isnads. I don't think he means that 3/4 of this book are forged. I think he means 3/4 of the stuff floating around in the universe.
But the Orientalists will use that kind of statement of Hajjaj saying, look, 3/4 of the stuff that
Yeah.
and say, oh, well, there you are.
Exactly. So if it's not put in context, it's easy to overestimate or overinterpret what that means. So when someone's saying, no one is doubting. Muslim scholars are not doubting that people made up hadiths for political purposes. Sometimes they include these hadiths in their books. And either they tell you it's made up or they don't say anything, and that's irresponsible. But it doesn't mean that that instance can be taken as representative of Muslims overall, especially because it's being identified as a case in which a scholar forged a hadith and was caught doing it.
Or Shu'bah was in Basra as well, which is...
Yeah, but I'm talking about the Ghiyath ibn Ibrahim hadith in the Abbasid court. I mean, this is an instance where this person was caught doing it. Okay. Let's look now at revisionism. What is revisionism? People say, this is historical revisionism. Revisionism in history is the idea that, study of history, is the idea that you are reevaluating what has come to be received opinion. You're reevaluating what has come to be received opinion on a topic. It's not in and of itself bad. Maybe the received opinion is nonsense or wrong, and you're revisiting it. The term is often used negatively. Now, this is just historical revisionism. But that's, I think, an inaccurate use of the term, because maybe it's correct to do this. But we'll use the term because it's useful, but we have to remember, I think, not to automatically assume that it's negative. What we're simply talking about is a movement amongst certain scholars to challenge the received opinion amongst Orientalists, or amongst Western scholars of Islam, about the origins of the religion. So, what this was a call for is its most well-known proponents are scholars like Patricia Crone, Michael Cook, Princeton, who's revised some of his ideas on this issue. People like Martin Hines, yes?
Hasn't Cook retracted from his position?
Yeah, he doesn't, his position on the Hagerism, he doesn't, as far as I know, I've not heard him say this, but I've heard people, his students say that he doesn't subscribe to the position he held in the Hagerism book, that it was more like an experiment, thought experiment.
There's a recent study on one of the Quranic palimpsest manuscripts, which asserts that Cook has even now gone further to assert that the Hadith tradition is plausible, historically plausible.
I don't know about I mean, I've read the article, the Sunni Hadith article by Bahnam Sadiqi, that's the one?
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, I don't remember that detail from the article, but the article's very good. What is the argument? The argument is, if you're going to apply the historical critical method, apply it all the way. Because what you've seen with people like Muir or Goldzahar, Shaykh, is they are critical of individual hadiths or a genre of hadiths, but they don't question the framework in which this drama is playing out. If the idea, and this goes back to the historical critical method, one of the principles is principle of dissimilarity. You don't take someone's history from that person. You don't take Islamic history from Muslims, because Muslims are biased. Muslims are going to create a history that shows the religion as they want it to be. When do you accept things? When it makes them look bad. Because why would they write it? It must be true. But the whole framework, we don't have, there's not a Christian monk sitting in Medina at the time of the Prophet who's writing his memoirs about this really interesting time, and there's this guy Muhammad, he's come, and he's got this religion, and today he said this and that. We don't have this. Everything we know about the Prophet, in terms of details, specifics, is from Muslims. Why should we believe anything they say? If the earliest books of Sirah and Hadith were written in the early years of the 2nd century, 110, 100 Hijri, so 730, 740. If our earliest surviving books come from the late 700s, then this is over a century and a half, in which people could have completely made up the whole history of Islam. So if we're gonna follow the rules of the historical critical method, we're gonna take material from people who aren't biased. Let's do that. The argument by people like Corona is that there is nothing that can be reliably attributed to the Prophet. She takes as an example the case, what's called the Constitution of Medina, or the Wathiqat al-Medina, which is the agreement in things like the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, the agreement between the Muslims and the Prophet and the Muslims and the non-Muslim tribes of Medina and the Jewish clans of Medina about being one polity, one ummah. Why had the majority of Western scholars accepted this as authentic? Because it uses the word ummah to talk about Muslims and non-Muslims together. Why would Muslims write that? Because Muslims are always talking about their ummah and how it's only Muslims, the believers. But look, early on, they used the word ummah to mean Christians and Jews together and pagan Arabs. See, originally Islam was not as it is now. Originally it was this inclusive movement. I'm not saying that. This is the argument. So the fact that it used the word ummah as it does suggests that it's true. What Krona says is, actually, it's not authentic because it uses the word, it talks about the concept of wala, or patronage. So if I have a slave and I sell the slave, I'm entitled to a certain percentage of the slave's estate if the slave dies, even after I've freed him or her. It talks about this issue, but she says the earliest legal discussions we have don't mention this evidence. Don't mention this. Therefore, remember the argument is if it existed, it would have been used. Therefore, it didn't exist. So her argument is, if this one thing that really people believe is authentic isn't authentic, nothing's authentic. Cook even goes so far as to say that if we use the common link method, we see that even this isn't accurate. Because let's say you have a certain hadith about a theological idea. And because you believe that orthodoxy is manufactured, you believe that complex theology comes along later, that early on a religion its theology isn't fully formed, that by looking at the metans of certain hadiths, you know they were forged later, let's say the year 750, I'm just giving this as an example, but the common link would suggest that it's actually earlier, let's say 700, I'm just making this up. Therefore, even the common link doesn't work, because we know the hadith is actually later. And what they proposed is to look at non-Muslim sources. Some of them include this text, Greek text called Doctrina Jacobi Nuper Baptizati, the doctrine of Jacob the newly baptized, which is an anti-Jewish Christian polemic written about 634, so 2 years after the death of the Prophet, that mentions Islam. It says that it mentions it tangentially. It says a person arrived in North Africa and he says, yes, I came from Palestine, and there's this figure in Arabia who claims to be a prophet in the tradition of Moses. They've taken over Palestine. They killed one of the Roman magistrates, and he claims to have the keys to heaven. I think this is in the text. And there's other figures like the Armenian bishop Sebeos writing in the 680s, the Zuqnin Chronicle from a monastery in northwest Mesopotamia in the 680s, 660s, 670s. The John of Fenak writing around 687, another monk in Mesopotamia. These are non-Muslims writing about the early Islamic period. So they come up with this argument based on this material that Islam actually was an apocalyptic a dispensation of Judaism, in which these Arabs in Hijaz kind of rediscover their Abrahamic heritage, and they have this idea of this apocalyptic movement where they'll go with the Jews and recapture the Abrahamic homeland of Palestine. And that the idea of Muhammad as a leader, as a prophet, and all this stuff is later development. That's just a very, very basic summary of some of the general revisionist view of early Islamic history. There's many people who have ideas that are even more divergent from the received opinion of early Islamic history than that. Some people saying that the Quran itself, all of Islamic history is really made up after the year 800 of the Common Era, that it's an Abbasid creation. So there's a large menu of options or of choices for different revisionist visions of the early Islamic period. Some of them more extreme than others. Apparently I thought I was going to talk about more, but because I'm going to, the next lecture I will deal with rebuttals of this. How much more time do we have in this session? At least half an hour. How did I think? I must have thought that I was going to take longer to talk about this. Let me just look at what I had to say. No, right there. Oh yeah. Okay, so why don't I, you know what, actually this is fine because I just have more time to talk about other stuff, so I'll just keep going. What there is, this revisionist wave in the late 70s, especially in the early 80s, but until today there's scholars writing kind of revisionist versions of Islamic history, including my own professor Fred Donner in his last book about the Muhammad and the believers, including things like this, apparently this movie that was made, this documentary, which I haven't seen again, but from what I've read seems to be fairly revisionist, including scholars like this anonymous or pseudonymous Luxembourg and his writings about the Quran. The idea that the Quran, the whole narrative of the life of the Prophet, the narrative of Islamic origins, is all a creation of at least after 692. At least it's after the end of the Second Civil War. This is the sort of earliest at which time Islam as a religion is created. And before that it was something else. This is maybe a general summary of the revisionist arguments. Now, some scholars have criticized this. Western scholars, non-Muslim scholars, and some of their arguments, actually one of their main critics is Fred Donner, who himself has a slightly revisionist version, but he's also very critical of people like Krona. And one of the arguments is who runs this conspiracy? I mean, you have basically a Muslim community that after 660 is racked by civil war. Several civil wars. Between 660 and 750 is the number of conflicts, internecine conflicts, is numerous, very large. Defies listing right now. It's spread from West Africa to Sindh, from Central Asia to Yemen, in a time period in which communication, any kind of central state control is very difficult. How can you possibly have a conspiracy that creates the person of Muhammad? I mean, you have evidence in Hadith collections, in history books. You have evidence of people promoting a pro-Shiite agenda, pro-Sunni agenda, pro-Kharijite agenda, pro-Umayyad agenda, pro-Abbasid agenda, pro-Kufan agenda, pro-Basran agenda, pro-Persian agenda, pro-Arab agenda. All this material is evident. Yet they all agree that there was this Prophet Muhammad, that he lived at a certain time, that he was very important, that his precedent is authoritative in some way or the other. So they're able to, they can't agree on anything. They're fighting with each other, literally. But somehow they all agree to have this conspiracy where they invent the story of the Prophet and the Quran and things like that. And by the way, the Quran doesn't have any evidence of this. There's no, Ali isn't mentioned in the Quran. Abu Bakr is not mentioned in the Quran by name. The Umayyads aren't mentioned in the Quran. The Abbasids aren't mentioned in the Quran. The Basrans aren't mentioned in the Quran. The Kufans aren't mentioned in the Quran. So somehow this document is preserved without, they come together and they decide, we're going to make something up that doesn't have any evidence of being scarred by our conflicts. They get together in a big conference, and although they can't agree on anything, they agree to do this project. This is not utter nonsense. It's impossible. I think. I mean, I think it's plainly impossible. In fact, the whole argument of people like Fred Donner for the fact that the Quran is a very early document, it comes from before 692 in his opinion, is that it doesn't bear any of the evidence of these civil wars. The Hadith collections do. Hadith collections, if you look at them, there's plenty of evidence that you would say, this was made up during the civil wars to support one side or the other.